All right. Um, I will get to the slides at some point, so the entertaining part will come a little later. But first, we got to do a little catching up on where we were at before, because it's been a few weeks. But we'll be in Revelation 7, dealing with the 144,000, everyone's most favorite subject, the most interesting of subjects. But I was thinking about this because last time we had gone through this section of it, we were going to deal with the difference between the church and Israel in Romans 11, and kind of went through that, I hope, sufficiently enough for what it was. But then there's another aspect to them that I wanted to kind of emphasize here today, because if you go through Revelation and you get up to this point, some interesting things have happened, but it hasn't quite picked up steam yet. So you read through the first chapter and you see the book introduced. John sees Christ, he's terrified, Jesus picks him up, tells him who he is and what he's going to do, and that John needs to write these things down, what he's about to see. And then we go off into the letters into the 7 churches, and we deal with different subjects there, addressing basically what are epistles. And then finally we get into the scene in heaven in chapter 4. We see the throne of God and everything going on there. Then the Lamb shows up and takes the scroll, and we break the first 6 seals. And what was interesting to me about this section is where this spot in chapter 7 is placed. And you see this pattern going through Revelation where you'll have 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls, and after the first 6, there always seems to be a break of some sort. And there's all kinds of speculation as to why, and I don't think that it's necessarily the emphasis of timing as much as it is to kind of illustrate something else. But we'll get into that. And so just trying to catch up where we were at, I'd really like to start at the end of chapter 6 at verse 12. So we've gone through the different horsemen. We've talked about what's going on there. Then the martyrs under the altar crying out for vengeance. And then finally we get to the 6th seal. And he says, and I looked when he broke the 6th seal, and there was a great earthquake. And the term there, we often think just means some localized earthquake, but the term in the Greek really just means a gigantic quaking or shaking. Seismos megos was the underlying term. So the idea seems to be more that everything is shaking, not just some localized area. And the sun became black as sackcloth made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as a fig tree casts its unripe figs when shaken by a great wind. The sky was split apart like a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. And then the kings of the earth and the great men and the commanders and the rich and the strong and every slave and free man hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks and of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and to the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? And it's quite a picture that he's drawing there, because it's chaotic. If you take it plainly, you take it literally, you take it at face value, you take it without injecting anything else, and just looking at what's being described here, it's traumatic, to say the least. It's massive in terms of scale. It's something unprecedented. And we hear that term unprecedented all the time in the news, but this is truly unprecedented, at least for now, until we go through the rest of the book. And what's interesting to me about that is what's going on is effectively taking the current state of things, not only the current world order as it applies to government and society, but just creation itself, and shaking it. And the underlying idea that seems to be carrying through not only this, but the remainder of the book, is that as the Creator starts returning in a more obvious form, creation itself is reacting to it. It's shaking. It's violently moving out of place. The norms are being broken. And you simply take into account these different things where at the very least, most of the globe quakes to the extent that every single person starts hiding themselves. The sun is darkened. So the idea being that the natural point of reference, we don't often think about the sun other than maybe an eclipse, and maybe in the winter when the time of day is a little short, but when the sun itself is now being darkened, and the moon, by implication, is also darkened by being turned red, and the stars are moving out of place, so the normal points of reference are being changed. Just everything is being shaken, and that's the underlying idea. So then it seems odd to then immediately transition to silence. And we dealt with this in part last time in the beginning of chapter 7 in verse 1. After this, so immediately following this quake and everybody hiding themselves in terror, after this, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth so that no wind would blow on the earth or on the sea or on any tree. In other words, there's no wind blowing. It's not that he sucks the oxygen out of the planet, it's just that the air stops blowing. It stops moving as we would be used to it. It gets eerily quiet, which is a very strange thing to happen at this point, because you would think, all right, finally things are getting revved up, and then it stops for a moment. And I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun, having the seal of the living God. And he cried out with a loud voice to the 4 angels to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, "Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the slaves of our God on their foreheads." So it's basically saying, hang on a minute, put a stop for a moment, pause, and he's going to take this seal. Now, we talked about this last time, about the seal, and how it's really just sanctifying people and indicating that they're saved. And in this case, he's going to save 144,000, and he's going to describe who they are. And I heard the number of those who were sealed, verse 4, 144,000 sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel. From the tribe of Judah, 12,000 were sealed. From the tribe of Reuben, 12,000. From the tribe of Gad, 12,000. From the tribe of Asher, 12,000. From the tribe of Naphtali, 12,000. From the tribe of Manasseh, 12,000. From the tribe of Simeon, 12,000. From the tribe of Levi, 12,000. From the tribe of Issachar, 12,000. From the tribe of Zebulun, 12,000. From the tribe of Joseph, 12,000. And from the tribe of Benjamin, 12,000 were sealed. And that seems almost like we've just gone back in the Chronicles and we're Numbers and are reading over and over and over and over again. But this is done to indicate a very particular logistic. It's to make it inarguable as to what he's doing. Because if he had simply said, oh, he'll seal the 12,000, 144,000 from every tribe, and then moved on, you would think, all right, well, maybe, and that would still be a stretch, but maybe certain groups have it right in saying this is spiritualizing, this is analogous of another group. But then he goes out of his way, similar to what happens in the creation account, of making sure in detail you understand what he's talking about. So in Genesis, there was morning, there was evening, one day. There was morning and there was evening one day. And he's going out of his way to show you what's going on. And in here it's the same thing. What does he mean by the sons of Israel? And then he names the 12 tribes of Israel. And so this small section in here that we're going to kind of hang out in for a little bit, and not to draw out things in exhausting detail, because there's not a lot to draw out from this. So, 144,000, these are the questions we're going to try to address today. Who are the 144,000? What do they do? Why do they appear? And when do they appear? So, the first question, who are they? Who's being addressed here in this group of people? This is the primary information we are given regarding these individuals. So we're not told here at all what they do. There's no description of, after naming the 12 tribes and the 144,000, all right, and then they go out into the earth and they preach the gospel. It doesn't say that. It doesn't tell you what they're doing day to day. It simply tells you who they are. So that's the primary information, so that's the most important information we can get from this text. In this chapter, very little is said regarding them, so the information we have regarding them is limited to their distinct tribes and their numbers. The number, and this is very intense calculus here, 12,000 times 12. Again, it's not pulling out some unknown detail. It's simply telling you an exact number. And what strikes me funny, perhaps almost in an ironic way, is that so many people have so many problems with this text almost because of how exact it seems to be. That because we're in the book of Revelation, well, then it can't be specific, even when it's specific. It can't be exact, even when it's exact. The number of days is as a suggestion, despite the fact that it seems to be very specific. So, why this exact number? Why 144,000? Why 12,000 from each tribe? And we could go and say, well, the 12 tribes of Israel, so 12,000, and then 144,000 just happens to be the number, or like the Jehovah's Witness, 144,000 will be given physical bodies in the resurrection, and everyone else will stay spiritual. And people run with this number all kinds of different directions. So why this exact number? Don't know. In terms of practical effect, I don't know. It doesn't tell you. It does not say, and he picked this number because. It's simply telling you, here's the number. And perhaps to focus on the reason for the number is a distraction from the point. which is that God selected a certain amount of certain people for a certain function. In other words, we note the number without needing to understand the purpose behind the exact digits, and instead pull back to understand the bigger picture. Certain things do not require a detailed reasoning to understand, as some things are provided to give a general picture for a general point. To require a nitpicky breakdown of something's basic for every single point that you come across is to inevitably fall into the trap of missing the forest because you're too busy looking at the bark on the trees. You're so focused on some detail that you're not given the answer to that you don't move, you stagnate, you don't move anywhere. And this is very common, not just in eschatology, but in theology in general, where people will hang out on one spot trying to extract something that just isn't there. And people will say, well, we're supposed to go and be extremely detailed in Scripture. Sure. But don't become so detailed that you venture well outside of what is actually being discussed. Like a series of directions, it sometimes helps to understand why you are taking the turn that you are. But to require a thorough explanation of every single step is to slow you down and reveals a certain distrust of the author of those directions. Indeed, a major part of the Christian's life is faith in God's direction, especially when they are not immediately understood, and sometimes requiring us to leave the explanation to God when we complete the race rather than needing it prior to crossing the finish line. So if you muddy the waters enough, it can be seen as an excuse to discount anyone who claims to know the way out. It often isn't about finding the way out, but instead to make sure no one can, which maintains a competitive but never-ending marketplace of positions. If a clear-cut and definitive answer appears, it removes the need for the competitors, and so rather than closing up shop and going with the truth, they seek to either disqualify it or so muddy the waters that no one can be sure. This seems to be a summation of eschatology in our time. Effectively, the approach of the enemy is to complicate the simple and therefore make the complicated hopelessly vague. The modern idea of deep theology seems more to be a realm of theology outside of the contents of the biblical text in question. You should only delve, with any certainty, as deep as the text itself goes. They acknowledge the depth of God's wisdom, but they strive to go deeper than the depths which God has revealed to us, as though we could navigate on our own the depths which God understands. We should only delve as deep as God has equipped us to go, as there is more than a lifetime worth of truth to learn such a depth. God is sovereign and his ways unsearchable. So we better not make it a requirement that he can be thoroughly understood before following him and his word. And I say all that because this is a series of problems I've been running into, not just here, but in a lot of different areas where we need things to be complicated because otherwise what's the point? All these degrees and all the money that goes into it sometimes becomes moot. And so if I've spent 10, 12, 14 years of my life and hundreds of thousands of dollars gaining a degree, and then I come to the 144,000, well, it can't just mean that. It surely must mean something more. I'm going to take the number, like 666, and I'm going to break it down based on some guy's name and some system that is entirely questionable, and I'm going to come up with a number because that's what people expect. That's how I make the most of my expenditures. And so the main takeaway I have regarding the numbers 12,000 and 144,000 are as follows. There is something to be taken away from it. First, God picked a certain amount. Simple and, I think, profound, in that God does not act generally, as though he paints with a broad stroke, hoping to pick up the right people along the way. Instead, he acts with a particular series of steps which he himself ordained and carries out his will to his own standard. He picked the number and he accomplishes it, down to the exact day. If you look at the lineage of Christ and how the Messiah would come down the line, it's not, oh, look, it was somewhere in the ballpark of the genealogical record and the number of people who were cursed under one of David's lines. It was down to the exact people, down to the exact day, down to the exact specification that God set forth. So it's no problem for me to look at the 144,000 and say, he picked the number, he picked the line. He said, here's the line that this is going to be considered complete and achieves. And we'll actually build off of this point soon enough. But the other conclusion is that this number is not small enough to be missed and is big enough to illustrate the point that God has begun the fulfillment of his promise to save Israel, which will be described further in a minute here. So in other words, God set a standard such that there was no getting around it, because as we're about to get into, who the 144,000 are isn't just 144,000 Jews. It's actually way more specific than that. And you say, oh, well, they're men. Well, yes, but there's more to that. And so God sets a very particular line, a fine line, that when it is hit, there's no avoiding what has happened. There's no talking around the exact point. So Revelation 14, 4 through 5 describes them with the following attributes. So there is a little more said a little bit, and we'll get to that when we get to it. But to kind of summarize it, they have the name of Christ and the Father on their foreheads. This is to distinguish them from the world, not as much the whole of Christianity. In other words, these are not mere descendants of Israel, but are saved through the Lamb and believe the Son. Thus, they have believed the Father. And I say that in that way because it's easy for some people to pendulum the other way. So on one side of society in the church, you have people that say Israel is purely figurative. They kind of messed everything up, and now the church has embraced everything other than the curses. And now the church is Israel, and they're interchangeable when you read the text. But then you have the other pendulum, which says, no, every ethnic Jew is just the greatest thing ever, and everything they do is justifiable, and so therefore, if they're a Jew, they're saved. And so people pendulum the other way, and people miss the point. And this is something Jesus had to deal with the first time he came, was these people who said, we're sons, we're descendants of Abraham. We're not these Gentiles, so we should be okay. And so, for this angel to come down and stamp the seal of God on their foreheads is still distinct in making that they're not just Israelites. So the first is that they're saved. This is what the Israelites should have done, as in believing the Father through the Son, when Jesus initially appeared to them, as the apostles and the early church had done. And so we see the process, which should have begun 2,000 years ago, beginning now. So we see what was almost set in motion 2,000 years ago, now once again being picked up. This does not mean that they are not entirely distinct from the church, as we've previously addressed, but rather that they have the same Savior of Jew and Gentile. He is now saving Israel through the means by which all men are saved, without removing the fact that it is still Israel being saved. It seems like you're forced to pick one of the two. Well, either Israel is purely figurative and everybody's under the umbrella of Christ, or Israel is supreme and doesn't need him. It's both. And this is the point Paul makes in Galatians 2 to Peter, saying even though we are not sinners from among the Gentiles, even though we're Jews and we're descendants of Abraham, we still need to believe Christ to be saved. So the standard of salvation has not changed. But that does not mean the distinction that is made with the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is irrelevant. That's not what that means. So keeping both intact at the same time. The other qualification they're given there in chapter 14 is that they are not defiled with women. So this kind of narrows down who he's talking about. These are virgin men. And that seems like an odd thing to say. But I think there's an interesting point to be derived from that. While there may be a fair speculation as to why this is a distinction, it could be due to a couple of reasons, which I feel are the safest. One, in a time which is undoubtedly perverse, which we are firmly in as it is, as sin and the devil run rampant through the world, it will certainly become harder to find men who are pure. This is not to say that married men are somehow lesser. I hope not. But rather, it is very difficult to find the unmarried man who remains a virgin, a trait which is even today seen as degrading to the so-called modern man. And I can tell you, in the manly circles around the world, in military circles, and firearms world, and the right wing, that it's considered by many to just be some lesser thing. Oh, you're still single. You're still immature. You're still some kind of lesser man or weak man. And so at this time in future history, it will be exceptional to find anyone like this. So here they are, not defiled with women. If not anything else, it is just another distinct trait to make the list much more obviously of God. Perhaps compared to God's army, or perhaps compared to God's selection of Gideon's army, where God used strange means to filter out men from the coming fight in order to shrink the army to a seemingly unfit number. So you remember the account, you started with this massive number of Jews and Israelites, and then God says, have them do this, have them do this, have them do this. And I have seen people take that list and say, well, he was actually picking the most militarily fit men. The way they drank the water actually illustrated that they had a certain efficiency about them, and they kind of run with that. I think that completely blows over the point. The point was to make the army the most unlikely to achieve the goal for the purpose that it would become very apparent who was doing it, that it was God. And this is what God tells them, is that the reason he did it this way is so that they couldn't say that this was their victory. They had to say it was God's. So it could be very much in the same way. If you were to look at modern Israel, even now, and learned that 144,000 Jews in Israel, who were not only virgins, but could also be broken down into groups of 12,000 into individual tribes, you would clearly see that this is not a mistake nor a random event, but was clearly a sign of God's working, and that to the end of his will to save ethnic Israel. There would be no working around the fact that he has begun to fulfill his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It would be unavoidable. The conclusion would be obvious. And you think, okay, well, there's an interesting list. So there are 12,000 from each of the tribes, and they're not defiled with women. But it gets even more picky. In case it wasn't hard enough to find these sorts of people, then it says they're not liars. There is no lie found in their mouth, indicating their position not only as being children of God, rather than the devil, who is the father of lies. So they are not just men who haven't defiled themselves, they're truthful. They're not liars, which again, especially at this point in time, when the devil is running around the world trying to pull all of his pieces together, it is quite profound to think even now, even if this were the only trait described about them, this would be exceptional. Again, it is a very basic and yet profound distinction. And as much as the age in which they live will not only be exceedingly wicked, but the father of lies will be stuck on the earth, moving quickly and violently and summoning all of his tools to bear against God's purposes. And so we see that these men are used to distinguish the fact that God is obviously at work, not just in the world, but in Israel. That you take this list and you make it so picky, you make it so distinct, so unlikely, so seemingly impossible, that when it happens, there's no arguing around it. And so the two sides of the judgment are growing only more distinct, like the sheep from the goats in Matthew 25. He's beginning to separate the wheat from the chaff. They are separated from the world by means of their ethnicity, their tribe, their gender, and their character. It is a very, very, very specific list. Now, there's one other thing said about them in chapter 14. It says that they are first fruits for Christ. They are first fruits for the Lamb, for the Son. What does that mean? And I think we're all fairly familiar with the term first fruits, being the idea that when there was a harvest, the first fruits would be considered, as it were, the at least beneficial, the best, something that would be considered of higher value than the rest of it. And so it would imply two things. One, a certain value. But I think that's not quite the emphasis here. I think it's the other application of that idea. And that's that there's an implication that there's more to come. First would imply there's more. There's second, third, fourth, fifth, etc. And so they're described as first fruits for Christ. And so the idea of first fruits coming from harvesting food, where the first batch gathered was the first of other fruits to be gathered. Basic, but again, a clear indicator of the point already emphasized, that these 144,000 Jewish men are the first to be harvested before more will follow. And this is the point the Jehovah's Witness completely gloss over, that there is more coming, that this is not some exclusive group of, well, if you're not on 144,000, you've completely missed out. That's all of Israel. That's it. The point is to take a first sample and to make it a very distinct sample to show what's happening, but it's a first sample nonetheless. As such, this narrow slice of the population, and so the current estimated population of the Jewish population on the earth, and again, this is going to be a rough estimate because genealogical records are a bit harder to come by right now, but the current estimate is about 10 million. And we'll reference this perhaps a little later, but in case I forget, in Zechariah it tells you. So Romans says that all Israel will be saved. And so some people run with that and say, okay, well then every single Jew who is out there right now, they're going to be saved. That's a lot of people. But that's not the list, because God's going to narrow it down. And Zechariah talks about how he's going to purge them. He's going to clean house, as it were. And out of the current population that will be there at the time, only a third make it through. So that's then to emphasize the point Paul also makes in Romans that not everyone who is descendant of Abraham or Israel is Israel. There's still a distinction to be made here. So these are the first fruits. There will be more to come. So the number of Israel that is left will be the remnant who survive through the entirety of the Great Tribulation. And this is described in Zechariah. As such, these 144,000 are the first of the remnant to be gathered for God in salvation. These are, in essence, the first of Israel to fulfill the promise that God would, or that Israel would be saved. God's promise, all Israel will be saved. Here we go, we're getting started. The progress bar has started to move. What are they doing? Well, now comes the speculative question. And I have heard no shortage of speculation, but I'm not against speculation, but I'm against definitive speculation, which seems somewhat contradictory. But when people are absolutely certain that they know what they're doing without being told. No information is provided, especially in this chapter, as to what they are doing in this current point in time. Nothing said. No mention is made of what they are doing, only that they are present on the earth and are sealed up by God. Therefore, there is little reason to speculate as to what they are doing, lest you overlook the reasons they are brought up. It is better to narrow down your focus to those things which God has narrowed them down to, rather than ignoring the information provided in search of something you have not been told. So, rather than sitting here and spending hours trying to speculate what are they doing, maybe the point wasn't to tell you what they're doing. Maybe we're not missing something. Maybe the only thing we're missing is the thing that we were already told. Sometimes what we have to do, especially when studying a text that's difficult, is to pull back. Read the entire thing. Read the whole context. Figure out what was even being said and why it was being brought up. It is dangerous to assume that the revelation provided is insufficient. And so I see no point in delving into speculative territory, since there is no means by which we could resolve the questions which would arise. Rather, I would spend the time focusing on those things which are mentioned and which we can be certain of. Because the absence of information regarding their actions while on the earth, we are left to focus on the information provided to us, which is singularly descriptive of who they are, not what they are doing. So, what we'll do is focus on their traits, which is that they are 12,000 virgin males from each of the tribes listed who are truthful, righteous, and saved through the Lamb. These would seem to be traits entirely rare in the time, as we mentioned. So these are meant to focus us on their character and ethnicity, which means the primary takeaway is that God is saving Israel. So this is what we've just gone over, summation. Why, though? It's easy to stay point for point following along. Okay, I get that this is being said. I get there's 144,000. We're not told what they're doing. They're distinct from the time. But why are they brought up? Could have just said it and moved on. Could have made it a single verse, a single sentence. So why does this appear here? And that was the initial question I had kind of going into this. It's not hard to interpret what's being said. But why is it brought up? 1 Kings chapter 19. Seems like an odd place to go. But 1 Kings tells an interesting account of one of the prophets, Elijah. And what's fascinating to me about this is how well this ties in to this point. 1 Kings chapter 19, starting at verse 1. Remember, the context here is that King Ahab is in power and Jezebel's with him, and she's mainly the one running the whole thing. And things are not going well. And Elijah has just killed the prophets of Baal, and people aren't too thrilled with him. So, in verse 1, Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all of the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So may the gods do to me, and even more, if I do not make your life as of the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." Some subtlety. She's threatening his life. I mean, it's not uber complicated. He didn't read that and scratch his head wondering what she meant. She was being very specific. And he was afraid, and arose and ran for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. So he's run to a city, told his servant, "Hey, you stay behind." You can speculate it's probably because he didn't want them to get caught up in all this. But he himself, so on his own, went an entire day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a juniper tree. And so he's picking a random spot. He hasn't picked one specific spot. He's running away, hoping not to be found. And he sat under a tree. and he requested for himself that he might die. Now, that's an eloquent way of putting it, but he's done. That's it. He's checking out. He's clocking out. This is it. I call it quits. And he said, "It is enough. All right, we're done. It is enough. Now, O Lord, take my life, for I am not better than my fathers." And then he took a nap. It's an interesting thing to do, but he took a nap, lays down and slept under the tree, and behold, there was an angel touching him, and he said, "Arise and eat." Now you can imagine Elijah's disappointment. He thought, all right, I'm done, clocked out, this is it, we're finished. I'll take a nap, he'll probably take me in my sleep. And then he's woken up by an angel thinking, oh, is this it? And he's giving him food, doing the opposite of taking his life. And then he looked, and behold, there was at his head a bread cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. So he ate and drank down and lay down again. Maybe he wasn't supposed to die uncomfortably. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." Now he's got a job. So he arose, ate and drank, and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb. So maybe God's going to kill him by exhausting him. Takes him to Horeb, the mountain of God. And there he came to a cave and lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Now here comes Elijah's motive, why he's doing any of this. He said, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away." He's clearly been thinking on this. He's got his whole list set up here. Things are bad, I'm it. Everything is just broken. I look at the world, I watch the news, I hear reports, everything is bad. And we're very familiar with this. You can pull up the news and pull up any negative thing, some Supreme Court decision, some election, something happening in the world, and think that it's all broken, nothing's going according to plan. And I'm it. I'm probably the last righteous person on the planet. And so God said, "Go forth and stand on the mountain before the Lord." And behold, the Lord was passing by. And that exclamation mark is very appropriate in the NASB. And a great and strong wind was rending the mountains and breaking in pieces the rocks before the Lord. And it should sound vaguely familiar. We just read in the sixth seal, mountains are shaking, rocks are breaking. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. Again, somewhat familiar. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of gentle blowing. And so here you have one big event and another big event and another big event. And God was passing by. And so here's Elijah in his despair saying he's alone, this is it. And then it gets quiet. And when Elijah heard the gentle blowing, things have calmed down. He wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance. So here he's been in the cave and seeing all this, kind of hiding away. And finally, when it quiets down, he puts his mantle on and goes out and stands in the entrance. And behold, a voice came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It's almost like a sample platter has been put out of what God is capable of doing. And now he asks the question again, what are you doing? So he repeats his list. You can imagine the timidity in his voice now. "I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone left, and they seek my life to take it away." And you can almost sense he might have a little doubt in his list there that he's rehearsed. And then the Lord said to him, "Go," and the word Elijah almost certainly did not want to hear, "return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you have arrived, you shall anoint Hazael king over Aram. And Jehu, the son of Nimshi, you shall appoint king over Israel. And Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Meholah, you shall anoint as prophet in your place." So Elijah's route out has just been given, because we know what happens next, especially his replacement, Elisha. We know what's coming, but he's not picked up and taken out. "It shall come about that the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall put to death. And the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall put to death." In other words, vengeance is about to be taken. You're going to go and put into place the pieces who will execute God's judgment. So go do that first. But he doesn't stop there. Oh, as for your point about being left alone, yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed, past tense, to Baal, and every mouth who has not kissed him. And so he departed there and did what he was told to do. And so why bring this up in this context? What does this have to do with the 144,000? Well, I think a couple points. One is the literal handling here. You see a very similar series of events, and then as soon as it quiets down, he's told what to do and told not all of Israel has done what you said they've done. You're not omniscient. You haven't seen everything. And so here we've seen, especially at this point in time, within the context of what's going on, and that's what the chart will be to illustrate here in a minute, is all the things that are going on the earth on top of God's judgment now starting to come down. Everything is just getting really rough. Within the context, we've just picked up where Elijah was at, and he gives his whole disposition there. And it would seem a very relatable reaction, as we are often faced with evil and power, even when it seems ought not to be the position of power or has gained authority unjustly. In other words, people are where they shouldn't be, and things are being done which shouldn't be done. And it can be easy to miss the significance of Jezebel's threat against him, as it's easy to read this account as nothing more than a personal rift between a couple of individuals. Well, Jezebel didn't like him, and he ran away. If such a threat were made to us by the executive branch of the United States, you would quickly realize that the reach the government has, if only one person is the offended party, if they hold a powerful enough position within that government. So if somebody high up in government, the top of the branch, as it were, looks at you and says, you ain't going to live past tomorrow, well, now you can understand the reach of what he was dealing with, which is why he picked the wilderness to run away in. And so Elijah voices his despair, gives his list, and his list could bring anybody down, as it's a summation of both failure in regards to the nation and their religion, with all apparently turning against God, with no one standing up against them other than Elijah, who is going to die. In summary, everything has gone wrong, and now he is the last man standing as far as he saw it. His despair is based on his perception that all of the walls had fallen, all hope was lost, and he was alone, a feeling which might be exacerbated in those who are alive in the end. And so I find a certain relatable factor here, because it's easy to say, oh, well, we'll know what's going on. There's a reason why the epistles in the beginning of Revelation start with, endure to the end, persevere to the end, make it to the end, keep pushing, don't give up, don't quit. That implies a certain struggle will be quite present, and that's that you'll want to quit. Especially since it's very likely that our ability to gain information, especially as things get heated, will go away. The ability to perceive time of day will already be pretty bad, and it's about to get worse. The sun will eventually not shine for at least a portion of the day, so your ability to tell what time of day it is going to get harder, and then the stars are out of place, so navigation will be pretty bad, and odds are news is going to be pretty hard to come by, if it's even reliable at all, and a lot of what you're going to hear is hearsay, and then you'll see bad things proceeding from bad to worse, and it's just going to be bad. The apostasy will have gone down, things will just appear pretty rough, if they don't already. So it is in this vein that God directs Elijah to the mountain and gives him the clear reminder of who he is, and gives Elijah the chance to repeat his complaint, only for God to direct him to go back to the land he fled from, do the thing which would most certainly enrage Jezebel by appointing a new king over Israel, and then informing him that there are 7,000 men who have not compromised. In other words, Elijah was not alone. He was merely limiting himself to what he could see, rather than expanding his perception to God's view of the world. And so it is in the same way that we are faced with the world collapsing, from the seals being broken, the apostasy being unleashed, and the church is already being reprimanded in the initial epistles to the 7 churches, only for this section to appear before the Great Tribulation even kicks into full gear, showing us that God has not only saved 144,000 people, but such a specific category of people were saved so as to illustrate that there is no limitation with him, and that he will fulfill his promises to Abraham in the way he chooses. Such is, I believe, the reason these are mentioned here. Rather than giving a group of people for a particular function, God sets aside such a massive crowd of unlikely individuals to show us that he will accomplish his will in the face of the enemy and will carry out the plan perfectly. So in the face of very obvious compromise and contradiction, God is setting forth the precedent that he will do exactly what he said he will do exactly when he said he would do it. To the world, it will be the end of the world. A time of despair and lament. This is why the term apocalypse is almost entirely negative in how it's used today. It is bad as far as the world's concerned. But to us, it is salvation, to us and to Israel, as God is the one carrying both the hammer and the saint. That it's going to be handled not by some random chaotic act of nature, but that the one who owns it, the one who has encoded it, the one who made it, is steering it. I referenced last time, and I think it's just as applicable here, that when the disciples were in the boat with Jesus and there's the storm going and he's asleep and they're about to die as far as they're concerned, and he stands up and just, as it were, presses a button and shuts off. Has not only control over creation, we often like to liken it to what happened with Moses in the Red Sea, where yes, the sea was separated, but if you read the text, he put his staff in and it took all night before it separated. So God appears to be limited by natural phenomena, but what Jesus did it didn't take time, it just happened. And that terrified the disciples. But the point being, and the same fear that John had in chapter 1 of this book that Jesus alleviates, is who's the one steering the ship? This isn't chaos for chaos' sake. This isn't some random series of events down to the exact number of people. God has it already set up. And we dealt with this somewhat last time, but in the same way, Paul brings up Elijah's complaint about being alone in Romans 11, all to reaffirm God's plan to do exactly what he said he would do, both with Israel and even just for our own comfort, that God is not subject to anything. And using that reality to illustrate the very point that justification is by God's grace, not our works nor our worthiness. As such, we ought not think that Israel has somehow forfeited God's promises by means of their works, as no one ever receives the promises of God purely based on their works to begin with. I don't like that rule change that people do, where Israel forfeited it because they did something wrong, but we can't forfeit it because some arbitrary reason. So that, I think, is one of the main takeaways from this being mentioned here, especially when you consider the context of what it's sandwiched in between. On the one hand, you have the end of the world, and the world just panicking, they're losing their minds, and then it gets quiet. Wind stops blowing, and God seals the start of Israel. And the last-ish question here, when are they revealed? Now we get to the fun part. And I love this part because I came across, even just yesterday while putting this chart together, I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. This is why I love visualization, because it sometimes puts things into a different perspective here. When are they revealed? What's transpiring in the world around them when they're sealed? Well, it's in between the sixth and the seventh seal, and these themselves are sealed and set apart. They are described in Revelation 14 as being first fruits to God, as we discussed, and so it indicates that they are sort of sample of what is to come, being then the first batch of Israel to be saved in advance of what is to come. So, I dealt with this timeline in part last time, but I want to kind of bring it up and add a little bit more to it. So we're going to kind of rewind and go into Daniel's timeline that he set up, and we're going to kind of reiterate certain things. And so the first one was that Daniel said in Daniel 9 that there would be a covenant of 1 week or 7 years. And like we mentioned repeatedly, there's not much we're told about this covenant other than its length of time. It's made with a group called the Many, so it doesn't even say Israel. It's just a group or collective of people. It might be Israel. It might include Israel. Don't know. It doesn't tell us. We're just told that there is a 7-year covenant, and halfway through, sacrifice and grain offering are stopped. So halfway through this deal, or 3.5 years, or 1,260 days, a sort of cease and desist order is issued to stop any sacrifice and grain offering from occurring. Now, again, we're just in the logistical technical details, but that's interesting. And it would seem implied, at least, that the sacrifice and grain offering that are being stopped may very well be tied to whatever this covenant is. That it's initialized or part of its detail is, or in some way involves, sacrifice and grain offering, which would imply there's a temple, or at the very least a tabernacle, somewhere to actually do these things. Next, we get into what he says in Daniel 11:31. The king sends his forces in, and this is also mentioned in Daniel 9. He sends a delegation, as it were, to put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And then an important phrase, he sets up the abomination of desolation. And we've talked about this before, but to kind of reiterate, It is at this point that the last king in Daniel 11 sends his forces in advance of himself to set up the abomination of desolation, and it is likely tied directly with the order to stop the sacrifices and grain offerings. So in other words, he sends this delegation out to where the temple or tabernacle, wherever these sacrifices and grain offerings are happening. I would be very inclined to say it's a temple. And so he sends his forces over there, his delegation, and they are one of their specific jobs, they've got two. One is to put a stop to sacrifice and grain offerings. So you can kind of envision it as they go into the temple and they issue their cease and desist order, and they tell everyone to stop what they're doing. And then their second job is to set up the abomination of desolation. So, by implication, it would appear the abomination of desolation is tied in the temple in some way with these. So you can almost view it as they go into a house and they take some furniture and they move it out of the way because something else is about to come in. That's one way to look at it there. Next, we're told in Daniel 12 that from the time the regular sacrifice is abolished or it's cut off until the abomination of desolation is set up, it says there's 1,290 days. Now, again, we're in logistical details, but this is, at least to me, fun because of how specific, how picky he's being here. So from the point that, so you have the 7-year covenant at the start, it appears to include maybe the temple, maybe it's existed before, we don't know. But it appears to at least imply that they're told, let's say, for the sake of illustrating this point, let's say some guy shows up and goes to Israel and some other people, nations around him, and creates a deal, a peace deal of some sort. And says, in this deal, there will be the allowance of a temple, and in that temple, they're allowed to offer sacrifices and grain offerings. And then halfway into that deal, the guy sends his forces in, they barge into the doors, their cease and desist order, and they say, stop, and they move everything out of the way, and they begin to set up the abomination of desolation. They're in the process of it. And that's why in Daniel 12, they're told that from the time the abomination, or the regular sacrifice is cut off, so they've issued their cease and desist order, and until the abomination of desolation is completed, or seen or visualized in Matthew 24, there will be 1,290 days, which is 30 days longer than 3.5 years. In case you're wondering, that's what the 30 days more is for. And that's when the abomination of desolation is seen standing in the holy place. So that's an interesting thing to put out, but I think it gets a little more interesting. And so we're told in Daniel 12, the time between the end of sacrifices and so on, the abomination of desolation, and there's a 30-day addition onto this. So the 7-year deal, or at least in its original form, is over, and then another month passes before the abomination is complete. So, time to start adding on to this. This is not to scale. This is not a one-to-one. I'm just trying to put things in as placeholders to kind of give an illustration of what might be going on. Revelation does not tell us exactly when at least the first 5 seals occur. You can kind of infer it. You might be able to speculate, and so that's what I'm doing here. I would imagine that the beginning of the covenant is tied in some way to the rider on the white horse, because he comes conquering, and as we discussed in that part, things are being shaken up around the world. The governmental structure is being broken, is being changed, and so it would stand to reason that he's created a problem that necessitates a particular solution. So one of the solutions may very well be this covenant. So somewhere in there, it's set up. Shaking the national structure of the world, it is likely that the 7-year covenant with the many is set up somewhere around this point in time, which means that either the temple is being built or has already been constructed. It is likely that the deal would include a stipulation that Israel can begin offering their sacrifices and grain offerings, as these two things are noted in particular as consequences to the deal being changed or broken halfway through. Then we get to the red horse, and of course, going over that, it's often labeled in certain translations as war, but the term war isn't really used. It simply describes peace, or the natural restraint that stops people from killing each other, as being taken away. So men would slay one another, is the way it puts it. People just start killing each other. Things get bad, gets violent. Then we have the black horse, and this is the thing that I didn't realize until I had put it down. I was kind of creating this box in PowerPoint and trying to get it in the right spot. And then I noticed, so if you remember the black horse and what's said about it, is that he comes with a pair of scales in his hands, and the price is altered of wheat and barley. And it talks about the prices appearing to be massively inflated, and that would likely carry with it famine and so on. But what was interesting to me is that it would almost directly imply a shortage of wheat and barley. Now, what categorically are wheat and barley? They're green. So it is possible that in the halfway through this covenant, one of at least perhaps the legal stipulations as to why the grain offering is cut off is because there's a shortage. And this could be one of the points that they sell, if not one of the main reasons. In fact, in at least one spot in the Greek Septuagint, in Daniel, when it talks about the sacrifice and grain offering being cut off, sacrifice isn't actually mentioned in it, just grain offering. So it was fascinating to think that maybe the reason why sacrifice, and more specifically grain offering, is stopped, they go into the temple and they tell them to stop that in particular, is because they're running out. There's this massive shortage of grain around the world because of what the Black Horse has done. Interesting overlap. Again, can't be extremely definitive, but it is fun to think about. Next, we get the ashen or pale green horse. And that is quite plainly just the death rate skyrocketing. People start dropping dead from all kinds of things, disease and famine and plagues, and things are just bad. And it describes it so bad that 1/4 of the Earth's population is killed. And based off of today's current population of roughly 7.8 billion people, that's roughly around, getting close to at least 2 billion. So it's pretty bad. And again, comparing this with when this is likely going to be going on, we then get to the martyrs, and they cry out for their vengeance. The fifth seal is broken, and they are crying out, saying, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, until you avenge our blood on the earth?" And so I went over that, and I believe that that's referencing just martyrs in general over history, not just a particular point in time, because that will come here in chapter 7, which we'll deal with next time. But they're crying out because the point of that seal is not as much the martyrs, as much as they are the spokespeople for their request, which is, how long until you begin judging? How long until you take out their vengeance? And they're told, they're given their white robes, and they're told to wait a little while longer. We're getting there. And then we get the sixth seal. Massive earthquake. Everything is shaking. Everything is moved out of place. The sun becomes dark, and the stars begin to fall like the figs from a fig tree, and people get in a massive panic. They are falling over themselves to find caves and rocks, and they're asking to die just to get away from what's going on. And I think it is almost indisputable to say that at the very least, if it has not already begun, this is the beginning of the Great Tribulation, which means that the abomination of desolation is around that point. And this is where you start to add on top of this over and over from the different spots within the different texts to indicate, all right, now we can really start knowing what's going on. Because one thing is very clear in the sixth seal, and that's that the people of the world, not the saints, not the prophets, the sinners, the kings, every man and woman and everybody who's on the earth at the time knows to some extent what's going on because of who they blame. They don't blame some god in general. They blame the one who sits on the throne and the Lamb because their day of wrath has come. The day of the Lord is beginning. So the 144,000 are not right at the beginning of it. The sixth seal is broken and the earth quakes, and then the wind on the earth is stopped. Things get very quiet for the purpose that the 144,000 will be sealed. Now, the Matthew 24 text is interesting because the conclusion, I thought, was a fascinating speculation. And again, speculation. But one of the things that's always stood out to me is in Matthew 24, he tells the people who are in Judea to flee to the mountains when they see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. Because then there will be a great tribulation such as never occurred, and so on. Why tell them at the last second? Unless this earthquake has occurred, the sixth seal is broken, the Great Tribulation is now set in motion, but a pause is put to it so that the 144,000 could be sealed, and so those people in Judea are basically told, take advantage of the pause. It's a short pause because he's just sealing the 144,000, and then we begin to go into the rest of it, but there's a short pause. So in other words, they appear to be told, take advantage of the opportunity. Now, that begs a couple of questions. One question is, well, are the people who are told to flee, are they the 144,000? I can quite with much certainty say no. And the reason I can say that is because included in that list are those who are nursing and pregnant. And I'm pretty sure that excludes men. So it appears to be more that there's this group in Judea who are told to get out of Dodge while the 144,000 are being sealed or set apart. So the Great Tribulation begins per the exact words and timing of Jesus in Matthew 24. When you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. It's been getting set up to this point, but it hasn't been fully set up until this exact point. And when the abomination of desolation is set up, then the earth quakes, and then the man of lawlessness is revealed. He sits himself in the temple. So, again, these forces have been sent to break the 7-year deal. They barge into the temple. They put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, possibly because of the shortage of grain, and they begin to go to work. They begin setting up whatever is entailed with the furniture of the abomination of desolation. And then, finally, after this, so 30 days after the covenant has come and gone, man shows up into the temple, walks in, and I think sits himself on the mercy seat and declares himself to be God. Not just a God, but the God. And it is at that point that a couple of things happen. And these are the things that everything or every text points to. So you could, for example, ask, well, why those in Judea? Why doesn't it say anyone who sees the abomination of desolation run? It narrows it down to those in Judea specifically. And I think fair speculation on that would be to say, well, that's because they can physically see it coming. So you could say that they see his entourage pull up because he, speculating in real time here, he's been getting everything ready. He's been getting everything set up. We don't know who the Antichrist is up until this point. And then the 6th seal is broken, and there is no doubt what's going on, and so the man of lawlessness takes advantage of his opportunity as well. The world knows who Christ is. They know who God is now. They know what's coming. So he immediately gets over there, walks into the temple, and sits himself down and makes his declaration. So to those in Judea who might see his convoy drive through, when you see the abomination and you see him coming and you see what's about to happen, you have a short window. He has a short window because the wind has stopped blowing and things have calmed down. You have a short window to get out. But don't turn back, don't pick up your jacket and so on, because it's about to happen very fast. Because once he sits himself in that temple, there's no going back. Once he makes his declaration, things are going to get very, very, very bad. And it is in that context that Paul answers the question in 2 Thessalonians. How do we know that the day of the Lord has not begun yet? How do we know it hasn't started? And that's because he said these things haven't happened yet. But he narrows it down. He doesn't say abomination of desolation, and I thought that was fascinating, because of all places for someone to put that, surely he would have said those 3 words there. He would have known what it was, but he doesn't say that. He says, when you see the apostasy and the man of lawlessness doing the exact thing, not just the idea of the thing, sitting himself down, then the day of the Lord begins. And he's not answering the question of when do we run. He simply says, how do we know the day of the Lord hasn't begun in full swing yet? And that's his stipulation for it. Whereas Christ, talking to those in Judea in Matthew 24, says that when you see the abomination of desolation, it's about to go down, get out. So it's a very, very close series of events, but not directly identical. And what's interesting to me, too, is the positioning of the apostasy, because it's quite apparent in the way it's worded by Paul, both in 1st and 2nd Timothy, but also in 2 Thessalonians. There's a build-up to it. It is a definitive event, but it is built up to. And so as to when it officially begins, I don't know. That's why I kind of just put it all over the place. It may be a very short period of time. It may be a very long period of time, making it hard to kind of see coming, which is why we're not told the day of the Lord has begun until we see it as a definitive event. My best speculation, man of lawlessness, sits in the temple, declares himself to be God, and the professing church agrees. And that's when we begin the very end of everything. And so I just think that when you put these things into kind of a visualization, it's just fascinating to see what's going on. Because then finally, the last question about the 144, where are they? It stands to reason they're in Israel. I don't see any reason to say otherwise. We've already been told through other prophets that Israel would be gathered back. One could say that that's currently happening, though, again, speculation. Undoubtedly, the majority of Israel are found within Israel itself. It's possible that they may have at that point figured out genealogical records. And the 144,000 are not mentioned again until Revelation 14. And I'm still working on chapter 14. Well, we got a while before we'll get there. But it appears that they're in heaven at that point, which would indicate that they have died. It's possible that they are included in the multitude of the tribulation who's about to be mentioned in the rest of chapter 7 here, that they're sealed off first before then being killed. Again, speculation. In Zechariah 14, it will describe the day of the Lord, and it's going to tell you what's going on at that time, what's being accomplished. In fact, I'll actually just read that here, because Zechariah covers a couple different things. And Zechariah is a very overlooked and very important book that talks about a lot of different things, but one of the primary emphases of Zechariah is that God is not only going to save Israel, it's telling you, at least in a certain portion, how he's going to do it, giving you, as it were, the logistics of the process. So in Zechariah 14, just reading through the first 11 verses, and again, this is kind of a flyover, what Zechariah is doing here. He's giving a summary. Behold, a day is coming for the Lord, when the spoil taken away from you will be divided among you. So you'll get your stuff back, in other words. For I will gather all of the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured, and the houses plundered, and the women ravished, and the half of the city exiled. But the rest of the city will not be cut off, or the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. So most of the city is going to fall. Not all of it, but most of it. Things are going to be pretty bad. And this appears to be exactly how God accomplishes purging Israel, or cleaning it out, as it were. Most of the city falls. Things are looking dim. And then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations, as when he fights on a day of battle. In that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in the front of Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives will be split in the middle from the east to west by a very large valley, so that half of the mountains will move towards the north and the other half toward the south. Again, being very particular about the logistics here. It's not giving some generic view of what may or may not happen, possibly analogous. It's being very specific. And here's another interesting one, though. We talk about people fleeing to the mountains. It may very well, at least at this verse, be talking about that, or at least giving them directions. You will flee by the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains will reach to Azel. Yes, you will flee just as when you fled before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord, my God, will come, and all the holy ones with him. So he appears to be giving possibly directions, telling them not only will you flee, so when Jesus says flee to the mountains, people who had been familiar with Zechariah, especially at this time, may think, oh, that's what he's talking about. And in that day, there will be no light. The luminaries will dwindle. And this is a collective, because if you read through Revelation and you break down the different events, things are getting darker and darker and darker and darker. The sun is darkened, and then it's darkened again, and then it's darkened until it's completely black. In other words, there's no light left. As you get closer and closer to the very end, it becomes so very dark that even in the city Babylon, at the very end of Revelation there, it's so bad that people are gnashing their teeth in pain because of how dark it is, which is, I would argue, an unrelatable darkness. It's bad. And so he's summarizing it by saying, in that day there will be no light. By the point that he has come with all the holy ones with him, it's pitch black. For it will be a unique day which is known to the Lord. Neither day nor night, but it will come about at the evening time there will be light. And in the day living waters will flow out of Jerusalem, half of them towards the eastern sea and half of them towards the western sea, and it will be summer as well as winter. In other words, he's describing after he's come what the effects will be at that point. And then, and this is a point that I kind of want to cap off with here as we end. We are so used to being the minority, as we should. Jesus says the way is narrow and there's few who enter through the door. But that's not always going to be the case. We become so used to it that sometimes we fall too far down that hill like Elijah. And we say, not only is there few, there's one left, and it's me. And we fall down that pit so easily because that's what the old nature wants. The old nature, one of the things sin seems to be really good at, is not always making us question the gospel as much as it is making us forget. Just plummet down that hole because you forgot you had a rope. And just make you fall. Look around. Look at the things that are going on around you. Things are bad and they're getting worse. Be like Elijah. Go find a tree and go to sleep. I mean, you'd have to be a pretty rough spot to be like Elijah and go to bed and think, I hope I don't wake up. Only to wake up and have to do it again. So I think we understand that part of it. But then we get into this part here. It doesn't say in verse 9 here that he will be king over Israel. And the Lord will be king over all of the earth. Not the Roman earth, the entire earth. And in that day the Lord will be the only one, and his name the only one. And all of the land will be changed into a plain, from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. And boy, it is so easy to read over that and not pay attention to what was just said. It is leveled. So when it says every mountain is moved from their place back in the sixth seal, that's not figurative. Everything is flattened. God is effectively taken to scraping over the globe and leveling everything. But Jerusalem will rise and remain on its site. From the Benjamin's gate as far as the place of the first gate to the corner gate, and from the tower of Hananel to the king's wine presses. People will live in it, and there will no longer be a curse, for Jerusalem will dwell in security. Finally, to end here, Luke chapter 21. I've read this one before, but I like to reiterate it because I think it really spells this point out. There's a lot being discussed in Luke 21, and there's a lot that could be discussed on this as for its placement and its timing and so on. But the main takeaway here is very short, verses 25 through 28. There will be signs in sun and moon and stars, and on the earth dismay among the nations, in perplexity. And what I thought was fascinating is what they're perplexed at the roaring of the sea and of the waves. Well, if we know that the moon is being affected by these things, and will continue to be affected, it makes sense why the waves are acting a little weird. But they're perplexed, and they're in dismay. It's chaos. And men fainting from fear. And that word fainting, perhaps in the modern English, is a little too nice. Fainting in this context doesn't just mean they pass out like some person in a movie. They're collapsing. One of the implications of the term, or usage of the term, even indicates they could be dying. That they're so terrified they start dropping. Even John and Daniel both illustrate this point when they see the Son of Man, or they see Christ, and they drop as a dead man. That's not just that they passed out. Everything kind of shut off. It's as their bodies went into safe mode. They could barely stand anymore, and so they plummet. And so men fainting from fear, but not just fear of what they're seeing, but fear and the expectation of the things which are coming upon the world. For the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. But when these things begin to take place, when you start to see a pattern, when you're looking at the fig tree and you're recognizing the seasons like Jesus said to do, and you start to pick up on what's going on, which encourages us to do that, and in Revelation 1, it insists that you do that, when you start seeing these things, straighten up. Don't find a tree to die at. Get up. Straighten up and lift up your heads. Don't just stand up and start walking along. Look up, is what he's saying. While everyone else is looking down and trying to get out of view of the sky because they don't want to see the Lamb and the one who sits on the throne, you look up. Straighten up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. And then he told them a parable. Behold, the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they put forth leaves, you see and know for yourselves that summer is now near. So you also, when you see these things happening, recognize the kingdom of God is near. Obviously, a lot more to go. We've got one last section, everyone's favorite section, martyrs in the Great Tribulation. But that'll be for next time. Let's pray. Thank you, Father, for the time you've given, for the opportunity we get to have, for the word that you've given, and for the way in which you've given it. Thank you for giving us illustrations of not only what good is to come, but how people have faced it in the past, how we ought to face it, and how we understand that even in our worst moments, even when that old nature takes over, you still give us an answer, that you still show us your power, you still show us your will, you still show us your plan, and that you do it so exactly. I thank you that you let us see these things in advance before the world ever gets to see them, and then we get to know with certainty that it is you who is driving them. We thank you for these things in Jesus' name. Amen.